Welcome to All In Together's Advocating for Survivors webinar. Today we will hear from Ebony Tucker, who currently serves as the Advocacy Director for the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. Ebony will be sharing an important update on critical legislation like the ongoing reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, as well as some guidance on how you can advocate to advance the needs and rights of all survivors through local action and by raising your voice in support of current survivor-centric legislative priorities. Ebony, thanks so much for being here with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. So, as Claire pointed out earlier, my name is Ebony Tucker. I'm the Advocacy Director for the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. The National Alliance is the organization that represents the 56 state and territorial sexual assault coalitions in the country, as well as the now more than 1,500 rape crisis centers in the US and the territories. So, our work is pretty expansive. So my role specifically is working on policy, obviously. I work on the Hill a lot, do a lot of advocacy on issues that are really important to survivors. So it's not just things that are related to the criminal legal system when it comes to sexual assault, but also services that are received, support, after sexual assault happens, sexual assault prevention, as well as a huge part of what we do. And in this work, I am greatly facilitated and aided by a lot of national partners, and we form a larger coalition called the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. We do like a lot of acronyms and long names, so please excuse me ahead of time because you may hear a few of those, but I'll definitely make sure I try to clarify and define. So the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, often called the NTF, is a group of national organizations working on gender-based violence policy. So this could be organizations working on sexual violence, domestic violence, trafficking, stalking, all of those things. And so we come together to work on the things that are really essential and that should be added in every reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. So that is our main priority as a body working together. So obviously, I know you on listening to this webinar are familiar with VAWA, so we'll get a little bit more into how the reauthorization of VAWA is working this time around as well a little bit later in the webinar. But first, though, I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about what gender-based violence advocacy is and get a little bit of an overview of it. So I do want to really make sure to emphasize that gender-based violence advocacy is much more than just federal legislation or going to the Hill or even working on the Violence Against Women Act specifically. Right? It's really about advocating for what is needed for survivors of sexual violence and what would aid service providers better in providing those services to victims of violence. So this could be anything that you're doing on the local level, grassroots advocacy, mobilizing partners or the general public to support your initiatives. All of those things are really, really important when it comes to advocacy. So we see people doing this work in their local city councils, in their local organizations, when it comes to really helping people understand what they need for survivors of violence and how better to support those who have been victims within their community. A piece of advocacy that is really important as well is administrative advocacy, which I don't think is often touched upon. Usually people think of advocacy as just legislation specifically. Administrative advocacy is also really important, and this can be done at any level, local, state, or federal. Administrative advocacy is really about looking at the ways that agencies responding to survivors implement the laws that have been directed towards their activity. So, for instance, we see a lot of child sex abuse victims being responded to by Child Protective Services or the Department of Children and Families and agencies like that. They all have administrative rules that they're supposed to follow to implement state and federal laws. So this is really important because this gets more into the weeds of how they're actually interacting with survivors of violence to make sure that what those administrative rules are saying is actually helpful for victims. And so the good thing about administrative rules is that they have open and closed comment periods. So before an agency can create new administrative rules, they have to make sure that the general public and interested parties are okay with them. So this is a really good time to do advocacy, and you don't have to be a policy director or an advocacy director or a part of any organization that does that kind of work. You really can, on your own, comment on these rules and say what's important to you and how victims should be better served. So this is really, really important and a good way to do advocacy in an individual capacity, and also a good way to encourage other individuals to come together and say, you should pay attention to these things. These are really important. I've created some comments or drafted them. Let me help you. I will say on the state and federal level, there are a lot of organizations that tend to draft comments around open comment periods for different agencies. So really paying attention to what those organizations are doing, using their comments as a shell or a way to help you develop your own, and then doing the same and passing that information on to others to encourage them to do it is a really great advocacy tool that isn't used as often as it should be. But we're hoping to see more people be involved. One good example of that is the Department of Education and the comments that have come through there. So a lot of what you're seeing now happening with Department of Education at the federal level, a lot of the new rules they're implementing, which is taking away quite a bit of the Title IX guidance that was set into place several years ago. What's happening there is really about the administrative rules for the Department of Education. Getting involved in that process can significantly affect the way that survivors are experiencing their campus and high school and middle school, particularly, responses to sexual violence. So all of those things are important. I do want to touch on survivor advocacy, which can be encompassed by all types. It's really just advocacy efforts of any kind led by survivors. So I will say that in the past, I think a lot of the gender-based violence movements, whether it was domestic violence, sexual violence, or anything of that nature, I think we really have included survivors more now than in the past. So when I came into the work a little over 10 years ago, I think that there was a feeling that if you were a survivor of gender-based violence, that you were supposed to leave your survivorhood or your survivorship at home and then come to work and operate completely independently. And I don't think that that's the way that we, and I say we just as the movement overall, should have handled this. I mean, I think that we have not been historically inclusive enough of survivors bringing their own experiences and advocating from what they have experienced, what they feel, and how they have received any kind of services after suffering abuse, and then, how it has affected their lives. So I really think that there is a stronger effort now to not just include survivors as advocates, because I think that survivors don't just need to be included, survivors should be leading a lot of our advocacy efforts and what this looks like, telling us what it is that they want to see, how they see services as being provided, what the response should be, how prevention should go. And so we're really seeing an uptick of survivors advocating, sharing their own personal experiences by choice. It's obviously every survivor's choice to tell their story, but if they choose to do so, really making that a part of the conversation and including it. So that's been a really great change in the movement. I think it was way too long in coming and should have always been there, but I do think it's key now. I will say too that what is really great about it, great about including more survivors in the movement and also listening to more voices generally, is really, really centering marginalized populations and talking about intersectionality. And that's really huge, right? Because when you're looking at the way different survivors may experience not just their trauma, but also the response of our society very differently. So we might have white victim who is 40 years old experience a criminal justice system very differently from a woman of color who is a victim who is also 20. We might see a very different response there in how they're treated by law enforcement, how they're treated by prosecutors. Of course, there's no perfect situation anywhere. Um, but really keeping those things and holding them and make the vast array of experiences and not giving just one picture, I think is also really important. So in short, I think the idea is that the field is open to a significantly higher number of advocates and really wanting to people to speak to their experience. And again, federal legislation is great, but it's not just about that. So really at the local level, getting involved in local government, getting to know your not just local rape crisis centers or domestic violence shelters, but also the communities of color organizations, whether they provide direct services or not, organizations that respond to survivors with disabilities, LGBTQ organizations, all of those things are really, really important because places that aren't traditional service providers, like a rape crisis center or a domestic violence shelter, also do respond to a significant number of victims of violence when those survivors might be within their own community. So, for instance, an LGBT survivor may be much more likely to go to an LGBT community center or a local organization than a traditional rape crisis center. So those are really those are things that really should be thought about, looked at. There's a great chance that you'll find avenues for advocacy in a lot of different places, just knowing what your local landscape is like. I also think that there is, in many places, um, not very much advocacy happening. So you might have larger cities or sometimes rural areas, but mainly larger cities that will have a vast number of advocacy organizations. But a smaller town that has a few of these organizations doing the work may not have been pulled together on an issue of gender based violence. So leading advocacy there can be extremely important. But what you want to do is make sure that you're getting a good picture of what victims of violence experience in that area, um, and not just those within your own demographic, but outside of it, and what organizations are most involved. You can take that to local city and county government. You can speak about the need for funding. You can talk to your local congressional representatives, the congressional representatives that are assigned in your district. Definitely talk to them. The National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, along with Reliance, has great tools about district advocacy, which hopefully we'll be able to provide to you all. But it is on our website, and we really would love for you to take a look at that. It's basically a toolkit to show you how to talk to your local congressional or your congressional representatives in your district. And that's extremely important because as a person who does federal advocacy, I can come in and talk about the picture of how things look in a lot of different areas. But that congressperson wants to know what is happening in their own home district. So for you to meet with their staffers or meet with them personally or their office and say, I live here, I'm your constituent, this is how this federal funding is helping us. These are the issues that we're still having. This is what we need. All of those things are really significant. And there are many, many tools out there, not just to help you perform the advocacy, but also to keep you updated about what's going on. So, speaking of that, I will go ahead and transfer a little bit to a legislative update and taking a second to focus on what's happening with the Violence Against Women Act, because I do think in your local advocacy, especially, or state level advocacy, what's actually happening with VAWA is going to be extremely important. So the priorities of VAWA, I'll start there. This is the reauthorization of VAWA that very technically should have occurred in 2018, before the expiration of VAWA. That didn't happen. So right now in 2019, VAWA has expired. But the funding for VAWA is still active. So basically, what that means is that when a federal budget comes around every year, which recently has been a very complicated process and not worth getting into, but when the federal funding for the next year or 6 months or however long is determined, the money under the Violence Against Women Act can still be appropriated, meaning that at the federal level, the money will still be offered. So your local rape crisis center that receives violence against women funding, their funding has not stopped. It is still continuing. That is not really at issue currently. What is at issue, though, is expanding VAWA to include really important provisions. And that's where we're getting a little hung up. So, important things that we want to add to this current VAWA, well, to the VAWA that's just recently expired, are more funding for prevention, more funding for sexual assault services specifically, tribal sovereignty on sexual assault issues. So this is a very complicated issue, but to simplify it as much as I can without being a sovereignty expert, basically on tribal lands, on reservations, what happens is that the federal government has jurisdiction when it comes to non-tribal people committing crimes on tribal lands. So the tribe has jurisdiction over its own tribal members, obviously usually Native people. The tribe doesn't have jurisdiction when it comes to people who are non-tribal members. So typically that is white people, other people of color, whoever that is, who are not a part of the tribe. For domestic violence cases, the tribe has jurisdiction over non-tribal people. So the tribal police can arrest, there could be prosecutions if someone who is a non-native or tribal person commits a crime on a tribal land. For sexual assault, that's not the case. So if someone comes onto a tribal land, commits an act of rape, they are not under the jurisdiction of the tribe. So tribal police cannot arrest them, and they can't be prosecuted by the tribe. What can happen, though, is that the federal government can prosecute, but that's very difficult to do and doesn't have as quick or as effective of a response. What you're seeing here is the ability for people to, non-tribal people, to abuse a system that doesn't have a strong response. So we're really trying to make sure that in this Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, that there is the ability of tribal people to enact their own justice systems on tribal lands. So that's significantly important. Also, the other I'll point out, and I think there are many, many important things that are happening with VAWA, but the other most significant thing that I think is good for this conversation is protecting the LGBT anti-discrimination clause. So in federal legislation, you will often hear people say that there is no federal law prohibiting discrimination of LGBT populations. That is largely true. The one exception in all of federal law is the Violence Against Women Act. In 2013, VAWA was reauthorized and included an LGBT anti-discrimination clause. That is the only one that we know of currently, and I won't say we know of, that actually exists in federal legislation. So it's really, really important to keep it. The House bill of VAWA has already passed. It's HR 1585. For anyone who would like to look it up, I think it's a very strong, really, really solid piece of legislation. Right now, that bill is in Senate negotiations. They are slow, but they are moving. So that might take us some time. Not just because the House and the Senate are different, but also because the makeup of the House and the Senate is very different right now. So you might have, even though there's, I think, an effort to want to keep LGBT anti-discrimination priorities, there also is a strong desire to make sure that more religious organizations are also included in providing services under VAWA. So that can sometimes be a clash when it comes to whether or not religious organizations are exempt from anti-discrimination provisions. So I think that is something that we will be discussing for quite a while because we don't want anyone to, and most of the advocates who are doing this work don't want anyone to be able to receive funding under the Violence Against Women Act if they are allowed to be exempt from LGBT anti-discrimination provision. That is very significant for us. So that's a bit of the conversation. Just I think differences in policy all around. So I think there are some firearms provisions that we're really trying to work on as well. In the current reauthorization of VAWA, like I said, there's a ton of stuff that I think is really, really good. There is a firearms provision that really works on making it easier for law enforcement to remove firearms from people who are not living in the same home with the person they abused. So it goes a little bit further than a domestic violence protection order. It can work if people are dating each other, all of these other things to really try to create a safer environment. But obviously, there are Second Amendment issues and all of those things. So it's going to take a bit of time to work out. So we're in the process of working on VAWA now and developing language. We don't yet have a Senate bill with any final language in it, but when we do, then that information will be released to the public and we can work from there and hopefully pass VAWA soon. So I do want to leave you with immediate action items, which I think we may have discussed a bit briefly before when we talked about local and grassroots advocacy. But one of the things that when it comes to what can be helpful with VAWA is really talking about locally what VAWA is doing for you, what VAWA is doing for survivors in your community, and understanding the connection between this big federal bill and what's happening to survivors of violence on a local level is very, very important. Dispelling myths about process. So one of the things that we tell people, and why I spent a little bit of time discussing the fact that VAWA is still fully funded, is that when there is a push to pass VAWA and not enhance it or increase and give some more of these needed protections, you may hear things like, well, VAWA needs to be funded right now, so we have to do whatever is necessary to make that happen. But to be very clear, we're not of the belief that VAWA is not going to be funded for the near future. And it really is incumbent upon us to make sure that these protections like tribal sovereignty and protecting LGBT anti-discrimination, more funding for prevention, or quite frankly, getting closer to adequate funding for prevention and services, that all of those things are in there. So we really want to take the opportunity to do that and also give you a little bit of comfort around the fact that an expired VAWA does not mean an unfunded VAWA. And the last thing I will say is join any list that will let you know when it's time to mobilize, and that will give you a good indication of when you need to be doing your congressional visits and making that move. So the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence has a list that people can sign up for. Anytime there are action alerts from our organization or from the National Task Force or the NTF, we will send that out to you and make sure that you have that information and know when to mobilize. So that's really key, is keeping up with the national organizations just so you have a better idea of when things are happening. We are by far not the only national organization who can give you this information or send it out. The National Task Force, as I mentioned, the NTF, they have a website with their own list. The National Network to End Domestic Violence does as well, and there are plenty of other gender-based violence-focused organizations that can do this. So really staying in the loop on the issues that are most significant to you, making sure that you know what timetable they're giving you and when it's best appropriate to move, and also being ready for in district meetings and really connecting with your district representatives. So again, hopefully we will be able to share that information from our district toolkit, and then also just checking the congressional calendar and seeing, you know, my district representative is at home and in office at this time, and it's a really good time for me to bring a few other advocates, do visits, and talk about how a particular fund in VAWA really works for us. So those are some tips that we have, and hopefully this was helpful. Thank you for bringing us on and allowing the National Alliance to do this webinar. So thank you.
Thank you for joining us to learn how you can be a more effective advocate for survivors. And a huge thank you to Ebony Tucker for joining us and for lending her expertise and insights. We encourage you to share this free webinar with others in your network who might be looking to amplify their influence. And we hope that you'll stay connected to us at All In Together, as well as to our partners at the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. You can find more downloadable toolkits and educational resources related to the topics that we covered today on our webinar homepage at aitogether.org.